It was one of those Oxford mornings that seemed to have drifted out of another century, reluctant to commit itself to the present. A thin mist curled around the spires and the stone arches, softening the edges of Magdalen Tower until it appeared less built than dreamt. I remember sitting by the window, a Bach prelude leaking from the radio, and the faint echo of bells coming across the river as though to ring beneath water. The sound was wrong, not discordant, but weary, as though the bells themselves had grown tired of the ceremony. I had, as usual, been reading the paper, half interested in the crossword, half in the obituaries. Both offered puzzles of different kinds. It was there, buried between reports of student protests and council debates, that a small notice caught my eye. Dr. Adrian Haldane, Fellow of St. Frideswide's College, reported missing. Nothing unusual in that. Oxford has a way of losing its dons, temporarily, into research leaves, affairs, or despair. But the word absent in the headline, "Bell rings for absent dawn," held a curious ring of finality. Absence, after all, is Oxford's most constant companion. People disappear here all the time into cloisters, libraries, or into themselves. I poured another measure of whiskey, far too early for decency, and listened again to the bells. The prelude ended. A traffic horn cut through the mist like a dissonant note. By the time Lewis arrived, practical as ever, and humming with that faint impatience reserved for the living, I'd already decided we'd walk to St. Frideswide's, a college I'd always admired from afar. Small, inward-looking, its chapel reputed for a choir that could make the dead stir. The porter, a man of habitual discretion, confirmed what I'd read. Dr. Haldane had gone missing 3 nights ago. His rooms were locked from the inside, then later found unlocked. The only thing missing, oddly enough, was the bell rope. Lewis thought it simple. A man leaves, the door remains open, the rope mislaid. But simplicity rarely thrives in Oxford. There is something about centuries of stone and silence that breeds complication like ivy. I followed him up the narrow stairs to Haldane's rooms. The air smelled faintly of damp paper and red wine. A gramophone stood idle, a record sleeve of Monteverdi resting against it. On the desk, a crossword half completed in precise, small letters, neat, confident, and suddenly interrupted mid-clue. Across the page, I noticed he'd written a peal beside a clue that read, "Sound of contrition." It was correct, technically, though an odd choice. Most would have written toll. Contrition suggests regret, not celebration. I began to suspect that whatever had drawn Haldane away from his desk had not been mere distraction, but a decision. A postcard rested on the mantelpiece, unaddressed but clearly handled many times. The image was the Campanile in Venice, all height and shadow. A faint watermark on the corner read, "Fondamenta della Misericordia." Remembered enough Italian to know it meant foundation of mercy. Yet there was no mercy in the way the image was worn, as if someone had pressed their thumb repeatedly over a single name now vanished. Lewis said something about checking the river paths, and I nodded without really hearing him. My attention had drifted to the fireplace where the ash lay unevenly disturbed. Among the grey flakes, a small curl of paper had resisted completely burning the tail of a letter, perhaps. I used my penknife to lift it out. A single phrase remained legible to those who hear what others miss. That night, back in my flat, I unfolded the note again beneath the lamplight. I couldn't tell whether the handwriting was Haldane's or someone else's, only that the phrase stayed with me long after I'd turned off the light. Oxford outside was silent now, save for the distant murmur of the river. And yet, lying there, I thought I could still hear one faint bell across the tower, echoing too late, as though mourning someone not yet declared gone. I sometimes think I began the case that moment, not when the file landed on my desk, or Lewis drove me to the college gates, but when the sound of that misplaced bell lodged somewhere behind the air, insistent and unresolved. A note that refused to die away, even as morning returned and the city resumed its habitual forgetting. Perhaps every investigation begins with such an echo of something off in the pattern of things, too slight to name. All I knew then was that the bells of Magdalen had rung for an absence, and I had heard it. The porter at St. Fridiwide's had one of those faces that suggested the permanent custody of other men's secrets. He stood at the gatehouse window with a mug of tea cooling beside a ledger, the ink faint where it met the damp. Lewis was doing the asking, steady and polite, while I let my eyes drift to the quadrangle beyond. The grass had gone to a deep winter green, almost black where the frost lingered, and the chapel bell rope dangled in the open archway like a relic stripped of purpose. The man said Dr. Haldane had been seen leaving 3 evenings ago. He carried, rather oddly, a small coil of the chapel bell rope over one arm, muttering something about repair. The porter had watched him cross the quad toward the cloisters, and then vanish behind the chapel. After that, nothing. His rooms had remained locked for 2 days until the dean authorized entry. Nothing missing, save for the rope. Lewis looked at me, expecting the obvious question. Why would a man of letters be wandering about with a frayed rope in the rain? I only said that Oxford produced stranger nocturnal habits than that, and we went up to Haldane's rooms. The stairs creaked like a reprimand, the kind a man feels for returning to a life he had once left. Inside, the air was still, like a room waiting for its owner to finish a thought. Books lined every wall, but it was the disorder that caught me, not chaos, but interruption. Wineglass half drunk, a candle guttered out mid-drip, a letter half-written. On the desk, a stack of choir music lay beneath an unopened envelope. The top sheet bore the title, In Paradisum. Lewis began his slow, deliberate circuit of the room, lifting papers, opening drawers, speaking softly as though the dead could overhear. He said it looked as if Haldane had gone out intending to return. I disagreed. There was a tension in the space, the residue of a decision. The kind one makes after too many nights of wine and too few of sleep. The half-finished crossword still lay where I'd seen it before, the ink now smudged by moisture. Perhaps he had knocked over the wine. The clue that caught my attention read, part of a church, also part of a farewell. He had written an answer correct enough, but curiously sentimental. The fire had burned low, its ashes cold, yet the poker was clean, freshly wiped. No servant would have bothered. The clock on the mantelpiece had stopped at 11:20, the exact moment the power must have failed or been cut. Through the window, I could see the chapel tower, its bell housing open to the mist. It looked almost watchful. On the sill rested a cigarette case engraved with the initials A.H. It was open and empty. A faint impression on the lining showed where a second set of initials had once been scratched out. Someone, perhaps long ago, had tried to erase their presence from his life, the sort of gesture that tells you more than confession ever could. Lewis remarked that the missing man seemed to keep odd company. The music dons spoke of quarrels, the choir boys of admiration, the women of charm. I told him that charm, like theology, rarely withstands close study. He smiled, unsure whether I was serious, and wrote something in his notebook. Before leaving, I opened the envelope beneath the music sheets. It contained a small folded receipt from an Oxford printer order for private program, 12 copies, Requiem Evensong. Dated 2 weeks before the disappearance. The handwriting that signed it was not Haldane's. Outside, the porter was polishing his spectacles as if the act might polish memory itself. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Haldane had once been seen walking late with a woman, the literature lecturer from Queen's, or perhaps Somerville, always the same destination, the chapel, after dark. We left him there in his window, the light pooling around the steam of his tea. As we crossed the bridge toward the High, The bells began again, their sound uneven, as if one were missing from the sequence. Lewis said the city had a way of swallowing men whole. I told him that Oxford never swallows, it keeps things just beneath the surface, preserved by silence. Even now, when I think of that morning, I remember the look of Haldane's room, a life paused mid-sentence, the ink still wet, the chair turned slightly from the desk, and I remember the faint smell of wax and ash that clung to my coat long after we left, as though the room itself had tried to whisper something unfinished. It was a grey afternoon when I returned to St. Fridswide's, the kind of colourless light that flattens even Oxford's beauty into something penitential. The porter nodded as I passed, reluctant to ask questions whose answers might trouble him. Inside the chapel, the choir had already begun to rehearse. I remember the sound precisely, cold, almost faultless, and yet it felt as though something human had been removed. The choir master, crisp, stood by the lectern, his thin fingers beating time with a pencil. His face had the severity of a man born for rules, not mercy. I waited at the back until the final chord dissolved into the damp air before speaking. He looked at me as one might look at a stranger entering confession. He said the rehearsal must go on, Haldane or no Haldane. Discipline was its own devotion. The boys were gathering their music, whispering as boys do when the weight of silence feels too much. I heard one say that Mr. Haldane always corrected their Latin softly, never raised his voice. Another said he'd promised to teach them a madrigal before term's end. I thought about how promises, in Oxford, have a way of hardening into regrets. Crisp informed me that Peter Lacey, the college baritone, had not attended rehearsal. I could see the flicker of satisfaction behind the man's annoyance and a certain pleasure in moral arithmetic. He said Lacey had become unreliable, distracted by his personal entanglements. The word was delivered with relish. He paused, waiting for me to ask, and I obliged. Julia Canning. Of course. Her name had been murmured around the common rooms often enough. A literary dawn, clever, detached, with a face that carried the memory of kindness more than its practice. I had met her once, briefly, at a lecture on Browning's Religious Doubt. She had quoted the poet incorrectly, a small error, but one that had stayed with me. Haldane, too, was known to favour Browning. Men like him often were scholars drawn to the poet's irony and its convenient disguise for pain. I left Crisp to his scales and followed the cloister to the practice rooms, where Lacey was said to spend his afternoons. Through the half-open door came the rougher sound of a single male voice, young, unsteady, but not without beauty. When I entered, he stopped mid-phrase, guilt rising faster than recognition. He said he hadn't done anything wrong, which is usually the surest sign that one has. The words tumbled out his affection for Julia, her sympathy for Haldane, the inevitable friction between master, pupil, and muse. He insisted there had been no quarrel, only misunderstanding. I told him that misunderstanding is merely a quarrel deferred, and he looked at me with the wounded pride of youth. There was a music score open on the piano, Nunc Dimittis. He said Haldane had been rehearsing it with him before he disappeared. I asked what had struck him most about that evening. He thought for a moment, then said Haldane seemed distracted by something he'd read a letter, perhaps. He'd folded it several times as if trying to make it smaller. When he left, he told Lacey that some absences are louder than presence. The boy hadn't understood. I did. On the desk beside the piano was a metronome, still ticking faintly. I stopped it and noticed a small scrap of paper underneath, perhaps used to steady it. It was a fragment torn from a printed program, Requiem Evensong, St. Fridswide's Chapel, the same title I'd found in Haldane's rooms. But this one bore an annotation in a sharper hand. Remove the last verse. I slipped it into my pocket without comment. Outside, the light was already failing, though the day was barely past 4. The sound of the choir resumed behind me, thinner now, as though rehearsing against the absence of something irreplaceable. Lewis met me by the gate, holding 2 paper cups of coffee that had long since cooled. He asked whether I'd learned anything useful. Only that the missing man preferred his silences orchestrated, I said. Lewis frowned, trying to translate it into procedure, but I didn't elaborate. We walked toward the high street, our footsteps echoing on the wet flagstones. I thought again of the boy's phrase, "Some absences are louder than presence," and of the way the choir had sung without him, precise but soulless. It struck me then that the missing Don might not have vanished at all, but merely withdrawn into that peculiar Oxford condition where one exists only as a rumour sung out of tune. It was a rain-heavy afternoon when I went to see Julia Canning. The porter at Somerville had said she was in her rooms, working as always, though the tone with which he said working suggested something nearer to brooding. The corridors smelt of old varnish and paper, and somewhere a typewriter clattered like a clock that had lost faith in accuracy. I remember pausing before knocking, not from hesitation but from a kind of superstition. One should always approach intelligence as one does a confession, without presumption of understanding. She opened the door with that calm politeness peculiar to women who have long been observed. Her rooms were neat but alive, the way a well-kept mind is. Books lay open in small, careful clusters. The curtains were half drawn, allowing only a suggestion of daylight to fall upon the desk. I saw immediately a book of Browning on the corner, its spine fractured by affection. She offered tea. It was weak, academic tea pale, indecisive, but the ritual suited her. We spoke first of Haldane as if he were still among the living. She said he had been a man of remarkable delicacy, though the word delicacy trembled slightly, as though she knew it might mean cowardice in another light. They had shared a fondness for poetry, music, and for those long conversations that end without conclusion. He had given her a book of verse once, she said, his favorite. Lines marked in pencil. It was still there, on the table. I asked if I might see it. She hesitated the way people do when they realize their privacy has already been trespassed. The inscription on the title page read, "For J.C., who hears what others miss." The same phrase I had found in Haldane's burnt letter. The handwriting was identical. But one line in the poem beneath had been altered. The lost leader had become the lost listener. It was a substitution too deliberate to be an accident. I asked if she noticed the change. She said she thought he'd written it to amuse himself, a small academic joke. But she looked away as she said it. The pulse in her throat betrayed something quieter, not deceit, but memory. She turned the cup in her hands and said Haldane had been visiting her often before he disappeared. He had grown restless, fearful even. He believed someone was listening to him, though he could never say who. I told her that Oxford has always been a city of listening walls that have ears, and so do minds. She smiled faintly at that, a smile of fatigue rather than humor. Lewis would have called it nonsense. Professors losing their nerve under the weight of their own thinking. But it wasn't nonsense. I had begun to sense a pattern, faint as watermarks on a page. Haldane's phrase, the altered verse, the missing bell rope, all fragments of a single vocabulary, one whose syntax I hadn't yet learned. While she fetched another book from the shelf, my eyes wandered to a framed photograph on her mantel of the college choir. Haldane among them, younger, less armored by intellect. His hand rested lightly on the shoulder of a boy, Peter Lacey, I realized, and beside them stood the dean, Ashcroft, looking directly into the camera, as if he alone were aware of the lens. Julia saw me looking and said the photograph had been taken long ago, when the choir was still a family of sorts. She said Haldane had once accused Ashcroft of envy, though she never understood why. The word envy clung in the room like perfume, invisible but undeniable. When I rose to leave, she walked me to the door. Rain pressed against the windows, and the smell of wet stone drifted in through the crack beneath the sash. She asked whether I thought Haldane might still be alive. I said only that absence was not proof of death. Her face softened, though not in relief. She said then, almost absently, that she often dreamt of bells not ringing but being tuned, each note struck in search of the one that would never sound right. Later, walking back through Radcliffe Square, I turned the phrase over in my mind. Who hears what others miss? It had been a compliment once. Now it sounded like a warning. I paused beneath the dripping archway of St. Mary's and opened the book again beneath the streetlight. The altered line stared up at me. The lost listener. I underlined it with my thumb as if to remind myself that loss often begins in sound. A silence mistaken for peace. A bell that fails to ring at the appointed hour. There are moments in an investigation when logic falters and one must listen, instead to cadence the faint rhythm between silence and speech, cause and consequence. That afternoon, the rhythm was off. Oxford lay beneath a fine drizzle, the streets reflecting the lamps in fragments. I had taken refuge in the Randolph, at my usual table by the window, a pint untouched before me and a crossword spread like an autopsy. Lewis arrived late, smelling faintly of rain and evidence. He said Lacey had been seen arguing with Haldane a week before his disappearance, outside the chapel. A quarrel about Julia Canning, predictably. I asked if anyone had heard what was said. Only fragments, he replied. Something about loyalty. Something about betrayal. Words that could mean anything or everything, depending on how deeply one listened. He handed me a copy of a letter found in Lacey's desk, written in a slanted, uncertain hand. It accused Haldane of manipulation, of using affection as leverage, intellect as weapon. You wanted everything, it read, but never to belong to it. There was a blot of ink after the last line, as if the writer had hesitated between anger and apology. I told Lewis it wasn't the letter of a murderer, but of someone learning the grammar of loss. He looked at me oddly, as he often did when I forgot the procedure. The crossword offered small consolation. The clue rope's purpose, twisted into regret, resolved into a spire, and I smiled at the coincidence. A rope, a tower, regret. The puzzle had, unintentionally, recalled the case. I folded it away. Coincidence, after all, is only another word for intuition one refuses to admit. Later, I walked through the cloisters of St. Fridswide's alone. The evening bells began their measured toll, and in the echo I could almost hear the missing man's step. The chapel was locked, but a light burned faintly in the choir vestry. Inside, Julia stood by the window, her profile reflected in the glass. She didn't seem surprised to see me. She said the dean had cancelled evensong until further notice. The boys were unsettled. She, however, seemed not at all unsettled, only weary. I asked her whether she loved Haldane. She said affection was not the same as love, and in Oxford that distinction can last a lifetime. I asked about Lacey. Her silence was longer this time. She said the boy was gifted, but ambitious, and ambition in the young has no mercy. It devours its own teacher. There was a small desk by the window, the surface crowded with student essays. One that caught my eye was an essay on Browning's Fra Lippo Lippi, the poet's meditation on art and sin. In the margin, Julia had written, "Love begins where duty ends." I thought it an indulgent note for a lecturer, but perhaps that was the point. When she turned, I saw a faint ink smudge on her wrist as though she had been marking something out, then concealing it. I asked if she'd written to Haldane recently. She said no, though her hesitation was the kind that carries the weight of almost. I left her then, the sound of the rain on the chapel roof steady as breathing. Outside, Lewis was waiting by the gate, hat dripping. He said the boat club had found something near Folly Bridge, a coil of rope, damp and knotted. It could have belonged to the chapel bell. I looked at it beneath the street light, the fibers dark with water. The knot was wrong, not a ringer's loop, but a sailor's hitch. Oxford men are many things, but seldom sailors. We walked toward the car in silence. Lewis muttered that the case was twisting into something personal. I told him all good cases were. In truth, I had begun to feel that the line between love and ambition was not simply crossed in this affair, but woven together like the strands of that rope, each tightening the other until neither could be undone without fraying. Later that night, I returned to my flat, the city humming faintly beneath the mist. I poured a whiskey, opened the folded crossword again, and stared at the clue I'd solved hours before. Spire. A structure reaching upward, held together by tension. Perhaps, I thought, that was what they had all been, Haldane, Julia, Lacey, climbing toward something holy, or merely higher, until gravity reclaimed its debt. The whiskey tasted of regret and rain. I set down the glass and listened to the faint sound of bells again uneven, hesitant, as if still deciding for whom they should ring. The river was still that morning, unnaturally so, the kind of silence that presses against the airs rather than soothe them. A single rower passed beneath Folly Bridge, her oars dipping like cautious thoughts into the mist. Lewis stood by the embankment with 2 constables and a coil of sodden rope stretched across the gravel. It was darker than I'd imagined, the fibers swollen with river water, twisting upon themselves like something that had resisted the current. He said the boatman had found it snagged against a mooring post, half buried in silt. I bent down, more from habit than curiosity, and examined the knot at one end. Not a bell ringer's loop. I'd known a few in my time, men with calloused hands and unreasonably tidy consciences. This knot was tighter, more deliberate. A sailor's knot, or someone trying to remember one. I turned it over in my hands, smelling the faint sweetness of algae and iron. Lewis said they'd send it to the lab. I said it wouldn't help. Rope, like guilt, tells its story only to those who already know the ending. We walked back toward St. Fridswide's. The streets were wet, the cobblestones bruised with rain. The college loomed ahead, the chapel tower standing in stubborn indifference to our questions. I asked the porter if the bell rope had been replaced recently. He frowned, thought a while, then said it had Haldane himself had requested it. Said the old one had frayed and he didn't trust it. There was no work order, no receipt. Just his words. Inside the chapel, the air was thick with the smell of candle wax and polish. The floor creaked beneath our steps, wood that had long since accepted its servitude to sorrow. I stood beneath the tower arch, looking upward at the aperture where the bell rope should have hung. It struck me that the missing rope and the found one might not be the same at all. Oxford breeds doubles, one for the eye, another for the mind. Lewis asked what I was thinking. I told him nothing of use, which was true enough. I was thinking of Julia's phrase, he believed someone was listening. The chapel, with its echoing vault and whispered acoustics, seemed precisely the kind of place where sound might outlive its maker. I asked Lewis to fetch the key to the organ loft. The climb was steep, the wood spiral slick from centuries of hands. At the top, I paused, breathing in the cold dust that smelled of old hymnals and oil. From that height, the nave below appeared less sacred than theatrical. I imagined Haldane standing here at night, the moonlight through stained glass, painting him in fragments. Perhaps he had rung the bell himself. Perhaps he had wanted to hear the sound of his own absence rehearsed. There was a small stool by the window, and on it a coil of twine thinner, newer than the rope in evidence. A spool from a music department, perhaps, but its neatness bothered me. I touched the edge and saw a faint smear of wax red, sealing wax red, the same color I'd seen once on Julia's desk, beside the poem. Back on the ground, Lewis said he'd spoken to the verger. No one had heard the bell ring that night, though several swore they'd dreamt it. Dreams, I told him, often arrive to tidy up what conscience leaves undone. At the porter's lodge, a parcel had been delivered earlier that morning, addressed to Haldane, though marked "Return to Sender." The handwriting was thin and formal, Ashcroft's, I recognized. Inside, a booklet of printed programs for a requiem service never held. The cover illustration showed the chapel bell tower, rope intact. Below, a misprinted line, "Let not silence fall for the unrepentant." A printer's error, perhaps, or a private jest. Lewis said I was reading too much into it. I told him that Oxford survives on the economy of reading too much. He smiled in that way that meant he pitied my logic but trusted its results. That evening, I sat by the window of my flat, the rain returning in thin, steady threads. I coiled the image of the rope in my mind. Its sailor's knot, its weight, its wrongness. Bells, I thought, are only useful because they end. The silence that follows is what people really hear. When the wind shifted, I fancied I caught the faint clang of metal across the spires, an echo travelling late from St. Fritzwide's. Not a toll, not quite. More like the memory of one. The Dean's rooms at St. Fritzwide's were exactly as I'd imagined, large enough to suggest dignity, cluttered enough to betray guilt. A fire hissed in the grate, struggling against the damp air. On the mantel stood a row of framed photographs. Prize givings, choir banquets, a younger version of the Dean beside a much younger Haldane. The man himself sat behind his desk, head bent over a sheaf of papers that pretended to be work. He greeted me with the cautious civility of one accustomed to being admired, but no longer certain of deserving it. He said he was aware of my inquiries, though he trusted the matter would soon be laid to rest. His tone implied both authority and fatigue, as if the disappearance of a fellow were a trifling interruption to the administration of eternity. I told him that eternity might forgive its own delays, but Oxford rarely did. He smiled at that thin, weary smile that asked to be misunderstood. He poured whiskey into 2 small glasses and gestured to the chair opposite. The drink was good, older than the man's conscience, I suspected. We spoke of Haldane, his brilliance, his volatility, his gift for inspiring admiration in all the wrong people. The Dean called him a man born without moderation. I called him a man who mistook devotion for understanding. We were both, I think, describing ourselves. There was a pause then, filled only by the small, incessant ticking of a clock shaped like a miniature cathedral. I asked, almost idly, about the college finances. A routine question, I said. Dean's eyes flickered, just for a moment, toward the drawer at his elbow. It was nothing, a reflex perhaps, but I have learned that the truth hides in such involuntary movements. I remarked that St. Fritzwide's choir fund was rumored to be generous. He said generosity was a virtue easily misunderstood. The clock struck 5, soft, decorous, half a second slow. I told him the timing was off. He looked startled, then almost amused. Perhaps, he said, we are all a little out of time. He rose then to refill my glass, and as he turned, a letter slipped from the stack on his desk. I picked it up before he could. The handwriting was unmistakable Haldane's. A brief note, folded and refolded until the creases formed a cross. I will speak tonight, after the bells. You may still do what is right. No date, but the tone belonged to a man who knew he had run out of hours. The Dean took it back too carefully, as though paper might bruise. He said Haldane had left it weeks earlier a personal matter, nothing to do with the investigation. I nodded, as one nods at a half-truth that has already confessed enough. I asked if he had heard the bells that night. He said he wasn't feeling well. I believed the unwellness, if not the rest. When I left, dusk had begun to pool in the quadrangle, the stones turning the color of old pewter. The air was heavy with the smell of rain that hadn't yet arrived. Lewis met me at the gate, carrying a folder from the college bursa. Inside were copies of recent financial records. One column had been discreetly altered, funds moved from choral, endowment to building maintenance. The signature authorizing it. Mortimer Ashcroft, Dean. We walked together across the High. Lewis said he didn't understand why a man of learning would risk everything for a few £1,000s. I told him it was rarely about money. Pride, perhaps, or love disguised as obligation. People give themselves nobler reasons for petty sins. Back in my flat, I poured a measure of whiskey and studied the copy of Haldane's note. The phrase after the bells troubled me. It wasn't a time, but a condition, as if the ringing itself were part of some pact between them. Perhaps it was. Perhaps it still was. I found myself thinking again of Julia's remark about the Dean's kindness, how she'd said it with the faintest irony. Kindness, I've noticed, is often a mask the guilty wear when they've run out of better disguises. Outside, the wind began to rise, shaking the loose pane in the window. Somewhere beyond, the bells of Magdalen struck the hour, this time perfectly on cue. For a moment, the sound filled the room, then faded, leaving behind that peculiar stillness that belongs only to Oxford, where every echo seems to wait for a conscience to answer it. It was the sound that had first unsettled me, not the absence of it, but its imitation. The porter swore he had heard the chapel bells at midnight on the night Haldane vanished. A solemn toll, distant but clear. Yet the verger insisted the clockwork mechanism had been disconnected for repair. Bells that could not have rung did. The kind of contradiction Oxford breeds with effortless ease. Lewis thought it a simple confusion of memory. People hear what they expect to hear, he said. I told him that might be true of the living, but not of bells. Bells never lie. Their deceit belongs to those who make them speak. We returned to St. Frideswide's that evening. The sky was low and pale, the kind of bruised twilight that seems to dim the city's intellect. The porter repeated his account. He had been locking the gate when the first peal sounded 3 slow chimes, then silence, then 2 more. A pattern he recognized as Haldane's habit when he practiced. I asked him how he knew it was practice and not prayer. He said the tone was too self-conscious. I understood him entirely. Inside the chapel, the smell of polish lingered, beeswax, brass, and cold incense. I stood beneath the tower arch again, staring up into its darkness, and wondered whether sound could leave a trace. The air felt thick enough to hold one. Lewis was at the organ loft, his footsteps muffled. He called down that something seemed odd about the wiring near the console. I climbed the narrow stair, each step hollow with age. At the top, he pointed to a reel-to-reel tape machine, its case dusted but recently disturbed. A lead ran from it to a small speaker wedged behind the wooden paneling. The discovery was both ridiculous and profound. A bell that could be made to ring without ringing the perfect Oxford. Illusion. Lewis pressed play. A low hum, then the slow toll of a single bell filled the loft. The acoustics were uncanny, hollow, distant, touched with the echo of rain. But it was the background that caught my ear, a faint scuffle, the creak of wood, then what might have been a voice cut short. I stopped the tape. We stood there, the silence after the sound more accusatory than the sound itself. Someone had staged the ringing to cover something else, a fall perhaps, or worse. Lewis asked who would have access to such equipment. The choir master, Crisp, came to mind first. He was a man who lived by rehearsal and illusion. Yet the reel's label bore an older date, 1974. Chapel bell, practice copy. I had seen that year before. In the photograph from Julia's mantelpiece. I told Lewis to find out who had kept the old recordings of the choir. He said that might take time. Time, I replied, is the only thing Oxford hoards more zealously than guilt. When he left, I remained alone in the loft. The air was chill, the dust perfumed faintly with mold and oil. Through the window, the city lights blurred in the mist like the notes of an unfinished requiem. I replayed the tape once more, lower this time, listening not for the bell, but for what lay beneath. A soft intake of breath before the final chime. Not fear effort. A man lifting, pulling, perhaps steadying something heavy. Then the faint slap of rope on stone. Below me, the chapel door creaked open. I looked down, but saw no one. Only the swing of the lantern chain caught the dim light. For a moment, it seemed the whole building exhaled. The false ringing had achieved what the real could not. It had masked confession. Outside, I found Lewis waiting by the car. He said Crisp had confirmed the tape belonged to Haldane himself. He'd used it during the restoration of the bell frame years ago. I asked whether Crisp seemed surprised. Lewis said not in the least. I told him to note that the absence of surprise is often the loudest admission. As we drove along the high, the college towers receded into darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a single bell rang for half an hour. The sound was uneven, almost human in its imperfection. I found myself counting the seconds between chimes, wondering which silence among them had hidden the truth. Later that night, back in my flat, I played the reel again in memory of the voice, the struggle, the false ringing. And I thought how Oxford, like faith, survives by repeating what it no longer believes, hoping that sound alone might make it real. The library of St. Fridswide's had a peculiar kind of silence, not the silence of absence, but of deliberate concealment. Dust had gathered on the oak ledges like an afterthought, and the air smelled faintly of candle wax and forgotten rain. I'd always thought libraries were a kind of graveyard, not of books, but of intentions. Lewis followed me in, his shoes scuffing against the parquet, already restless. He had grown used to the endless loops of my inquiries, the slow circles that promised revelation but usually returned to the same small point. He asked what we were looking for, and I told him we weren't looking, only waiting to notice. The college librarian, a grey figure named Mrs. Elphick, produced the photograph at my request. It had been discovered among a stack of alumni archives, unlabeled, undated, and therefore infinitely more interesting. She placed it on the desk as one might set down a fragile truth. I leaned over it, a choir, perhaps 20 souls, arranged in 2 uneven rows. The light was summer strong enough to make the robes gleam. Haldane stood near the center, a hand resting on the shoulder of another man, Ashcroft, the dean, younger, his expression uncertain even in confidence. To the left, Julia Canning, bareheaded, smiling at something beyond the frame. The camera had caught intimacy by accident. Lewis said he couldn't see the relevance. I told him relevance is the consolation of the unimaginative. It wasn't the faces that interested me, but the inscription on the back faint, written in the same steady, italic hand as the altered Browning line. Those who hear, remember. I asked Mrs. Elphick about the origin of the photograph. She said it had come from a box of donations after the death of a retired fellow whose name was forgotten. I thanked her, though what I meant was that she had already told me more than she realized. Oxford forgets only what it chooses to forget. When she left us, I studied the photograph again under the lamp. The light caught something faint, the outline of another figure, half in shadow, behind the choir. A blurred face, as if someone had stepped forward too late. A man in plain clothes, not robes. I adjusted my glasses. The face was indistinct, but the posture of the unmistakable head slightly inclined, observing rather than belonging. Lewis said it was probably the photographer's assistant. Perhaps. Yet the more I looked, the more it seemed as though the shadowed figure were part of the scene's intention, not its accident. Someone who had meant to be forgotten. On the desk beside me lay the college register from the same year. I turned the pages until I found Haldane's name, written in his own hand. Beneath it, a second signature, Ashcroft's, as dean. The ink of both was faded but identical in tone, as though they'd been written at the same sitting. Below, in smaller letters, another name, one I hadn't encountered before, Dr. G. Crisp. I ran my thumb along it, and a small deduction stirred. Not revelation, merely alignment. I remembered Crisp's remark about the choir's need for order, his irritation at Lacey's absence, his insistence that the dead be replaced by the living without delay. It sounded like discipline. It now sounded like rehearsal. Lewis was paging through a nearby ledger, more from loyalty than curiosity. He muttered that the same three names, Haldane, Ashcroft, Crisp, appeared on the committee responsible for the Requiem Evensong programs, the ones we had found printed but never used. I nodded. 3 signatures that had sanctioned an event never meant to occur, and yet one that perhaps did privately, secretly, after the bells. Outside, the wind stirred through the quadrangle. The lamps flickered, casting small pools of gold that never quite touched each other. I felt that same disjointedness between the men in the photograph, a harmony pretending to unity. Before we left, I slipped the photograph back into its sleeve, though not before tracing the faint inscription once more with my finger. Those who hear, remember. It was not dedication, but accusation. Lewis asked what I thought it meant. I told him that some truths are written not to be read, but to be overheard. He frowned, as he always did when I grew opaque. That night I dreamt of the photograph, the light, the choir, the blurred man at the edge. In the dream, the bell was ringing again, though no one's lips moved. Only the shadowed figure turned toward the sound, as if recognizing it. When I woke, the phrase lingered at the edge of my thoughts, like a residue of smoke. Those who hear, remember. And I wondered, not for the first time, whether memory was merely the punishment for listening too closely. It was dawn when I climbed the tower for the last time. The city below was caught in that brief hesitation between darkness and day, the kind of light that forgives everything and understands nothing. My breath rose pale in the cold, mingling with the mist that drifted across the quadrangle. The bells of St. Fridswide's waited above me in their wooden cradle, still as witnesses before confession. Ashcroft was there, his coat unbuttoned despite the chill, his hands clasped behind his back in a parody of calm. He turned as I approached, and for a moment we were simply 2 tired men who had both stayed too long in Oxford. He asked if it was necessary for this climb, this conversation. I told him necessity was all we had left. He said Haldane had come to him that night desperate, drunk perhaps, but coherent enough to threaten exposure. The missing funds, the forged signatures, the quiet rearrangement of money meant for music into the dean's private account. He had called it restitution, not theft. He said the choir needed more than wages. They needed beauty, and beauty cost more than honesty could afford. They had argued beneath this very tower. The rain, the darkness, the broken bell rope all conspiring toward inevitability. Haldane slipped, he said, or perhaps jumped. He didn't know. I asked whether he had rung the bells afterward. He looked away and said he had played a recording to keep the others from hearing the fall. The reel-to-reel had been his own, inherited from the college archives. He'd spliced the sound of the bells over the silence that followed so that Oxford would hear its own lie and call it tradition. He had done it, he said, not to deceive, but to protect. I told him that protection is the kindest disguise deceit ever wears. He smiled faintly, the weary smile of a man whose guilt had learned to walk beside him like an old friend. Then he asked whether I intended to arrest him. I said there were no charges for cowardice, only consequences. He moved toward the window. Below us, the first sunlight touched the chapel roof, turning the lead to gold for an instant before fading. He said he sometimes thought of Haldane as a man too full of sound music, argument, regret, and that perhaps the fall had been a form of silence he'd longed for. I didn't answer. There are moments when morality feels like an intrusion. When he finally turned back, his face had changed. He asked whether I ever envied Faith. the kind that believes every bell tolls for a reason. I told him I envied only certainty, and that Oxford had cured me of that long ago. We descended without speaking. At the base of the tower, the porter was lighting a cigarette, his eyes dull with routine. He nodded at us as though we had come down from ordinary inspection, not confession. Ashcroft walked away across the quadrangle, his figure shrinking until the fog took him. I watched him go, knowing that his resignation would reach the bishop before my report ever did. Men like him never waited to be judged. They preferred to schedule their absolution. Lewis joined me later, holding a paper cup of coffee and a silence of his own. He asked if it was murder. I said it was neither that nor its opposite. It was simply what happens when two men mistake dignity for truth. The bells rang at 9. For the first time since the beginning of the case, they sounded slightly off-tempo, one note trailing a breath behind the others. I mentioned it to Lewis. He shrugged. "A mechanical fault," he said. I told him no machine makes that kind of error, only people do. We stood there until the sound faded. Somewhere beyond the college, traffic began. Bicycles clicked against cobblestones, and the city resumed its imitation of innocence. Later, in my flat, I unfolded Haldane's letter once more. "You may still do what is right." The ink had bled slightly from the rain. The words softened almost to tenderness. I poured a measure of whiskey and listened to the faint echo of the bells that still lived somewhere in my head. Oxford was awake again, its towers catching the light like instruments returned after morning. I couldn't tell whether the case was over or only paused. All I knew was that the last bell had rung, and that I was still listening. It was evening again, that soft hour, when Oxford began to forget itself, and the light along Broad Street turned the color of old sherry. The city had exhaled the day's intellect, leaving behind its quieter residue. Footsteps fading under the Bridge of Sighs, the dull hum of bicycles, the faint chiming of a pub door closing against the chill. I found myself, inevitably, at the White Horse. Some habits are less about thirst than about needing a place where silence feels permitted. Lewis arrived late, rain on his coat, and a frown already forming not from irritation, but from thought. He ordered the same as me, though he never finished it. He said Ashcroft had submitted his resignation that morning, citing ill health. I said that was one way of phrasing conscience. The college had accepted it immediately. No questions, no ceremony. Oxford forgives most sins provided they are well written. He asked whether I was satisfied with the conclusion that Haldane's death was an accident, that the dean had merely tried to spare the college shame. I said the file would read that way. Yes. The truth, I added, would do what truth always does in this city. Adapt to its surroundings. Lewis looked unconvinced. He said he still couldn't decide whether Ashcroft had pushed him or merely let him fall. I told him it hardly mattered now. In the end, both acts require the same absence of love. He watched me for a while, then asked whether I believed Julia Canning knew. I said she knew as much as she needed to, which is to say, more than she wished. She had left Oxford that morning for a visiting fellowship in Venice. I imagined her standing beside the campanile, looking up at the bells, perhaps remembering how sound can both conceal and confess. Outside, the rain had begun again, thin and deliberate. It ran down the pub window like ink on an old letter. I thought of Haldane's final note. "You may still do what is right." He had not written it to Ashcroft alone. The phrase was too careful, too public in its intimacy. Perhaps he had meant it for all of us, for those who hear too much and act too late. Lewis tried to change the subject. He mentioned the crossword in the morning paper, something about an impossible clue. I told him there are no impossible clues, only questions we're not ready to ask. He laughed, but softly, as if laughter had to mind its manners here. The landlord turned up the lights a little. A group of students entered, dripping with youth and confidence, their chatter puncturing the evening like a rehearsal for futures they hadn't yet earned. I envied them, and then I didn't. I've always found innocence less moving than regret. When Lewis left, he said he'd see me in the morning. I nodded, though I wasn't sure whether there would be anything left to see. The case was done in the procedural sense, but cases never end. They merely recede until memory mistakes them for understanding. I stayed long after closing time, the last glass half empty before me. The barman didn't ask me to leave. He had seen too many men in that corner wrestling with invisible company. I thought of the rope, the bells, the photograph, the poem, all the small, stubborn fragments that had pretended to form a whole. Yet even now, something refused to settle. It came to me not as a revelation, but as an aftertaste. The recording of the false ringing had been made years before, when Haldane and Ashcroft were young. Perhaps it was not merely a cover for death, but an echo of something older, a pact, a private elegy rehearsed long before either of them knew the words. The rain stopped. Outside, the lamps blurred against the wet pavement, their reflections trembling like the surface of thought. I drained the glass, though the taste no longer mattered. There is a peculiar loneliness in finishing what can't be finished. As I left, the bells from St. Mary's struck the hour. Their rhythm was imperfect, one note lagging slightly behind the rest, a delay that no repairman would ever quite correct. I paused, listening. Oxford, in its infinite patience, was reminding me that even the flawed are faithful to their pattern. Walking back along the High, I felt that familiar ache, not grief, not triumph, something quieter. The case was closed, the city unchanged, and I was once again only a man moving through its music. The bells followed me, faint but insistent, until the last sound folded into silence.